If you've kept up to date with my War in Middle-earth series, then you'll know that I've just reached the point where Gondor has hit the height of its power. Unless you're watching this several years from now, and in that case, hello future person. Anyway, spanning from Rhûn to Harad to Mirkwood to Farbad, Gondor was the dominant power in Middle-earth at that point, so just how powerful were they? Unfortunately, Tolkien never really had a habit of giving numbers, he was more of a words guy. This leaves it up to us to make guesses, educated guesses that is, and try to answer these questions on our own using the information that he did leave us. Of course, I could just give an arbitrary number and be done with it, but that's not really the way I want to operate. 1. What's the fun in giving a random number? And 2. I'm trying to convince the viewers of my estimate and my position as well. So how can we possibly get a number from this when Tolkien gives us so few numbers in the first place? After all, Tolkien never gives us the full size of Gondor's army at any point in his writing, let alone during the height of their power. We're basically pulling nothing from nothing. But we can work around this. Sort of. We can extrapolate from what I believe to be semi-accurate figures. And what are those figures? Well, the ones that I give in my How Big Is Gondor army video. You've probably seen it, it's a piece of shit. But I'm happy with the numbers I give in that video, and even a year and a half onwards, I wouldn't really change them that much. The number I gave was around 24,000 I believe, I don't know, I don't really want to go back and watch that video to be honest. And if I were to change it, I might make it slightly larger, but certainly no more than 30,000. So that gives us a base of, let's say, 25,000. This is Gondor at its weakest, therefore Gondor at its strongest must be a much larger number. But how can we possibly know this number? Our first clue is something Imrahil says in Return of the King. When the host of the West is about to set off for the Black Gate, Imrahil expresses dismay at the 7,000 strong force and says that it is, direct quote, scarce as many as a vanguard of its army in the days of its power. So 7,000 is hardly a vanguard, but there aren't exactly any rules as to how large a vanguard can be. At maximum, it can probably be 1/3 of an army. Any more and, well, you just kind of have two armies. So 21,000 at the minimum, and this is just a field army we're talking about. However, if you make the assumption that a vanguard is 1/5 of an army, assuming the army has a vanguard, a center, a left, and a right flank, as well as rear or / reserves, that number jumps as high as 35,000. This is called a 5-part battle formation, and they were quite common in our own history, although not all parts were necessarily the same size. But let's not get too technical here, so we'll assume that they all are the same size, or they all kind of equal that much, so we can just use 35,000 as a number. So if we're using this as a rule, then the field armies Gondor used to deploy were probably around 35,000, give or take a few. But of course, that's a single field army, and when you have such vast territory like Gondor did have, you don't deploy all of your army in the one place. Alright, so we're making the assumption that Gondor's military strength during the War of the Ring wasn't even equal to a single field army Gondor used to deploy during its days of power. The phrase days of power is pretty vague. It might mean broadly Gondor during the days of the kings, or specifically Gondor during Hiarmendikil's reign, the official height of Gondor's power. In an attempt to keep this simple, let's say he meant the former, but I'll also give smaller figures for the latter. So where do we go from here? Well, if we're assuming that Gondor's field armies were around about 35,000, then let's jump to a date when Gondor deployed two armies at the same time to deal with two simultaneous threats. And we're jumping ahead of War in Middle-earth a little bit, and that's okay, but I'll keep it brief. It's the final battles with the Wainrider Easterlings in 1944 of the Third Age during the reign of King Onderher. When the Wainriders and the Haradrim allies approach Gondor's territory, King Onderher splits his army. He takes the northern army north to deal with the Wainriders, where he gives command of the southern army to his general Eärnil, who is supposed to be fighting the Haradrim. And this southern army is described as being smaller. If we're assuming that Onderher's army is 35,000 strong, then we might assume Eärnil's is 25,000. Altogether, that's 60,000 men, and as I said before, that's just the field armies. You'd have defensive forces guarding your lands as well. Considering the Wainriders were a pretty dire threat, Onderher probably pulled more troops into his army, so you could maybe assume that he has 10 to 20,000 or so defending at home. So what do we end up with? Well, 70 to 80,000 soldiers across all of Gondor. It's worth mentioning that if Imrahil was specifically talking about Hiarmendikil's reign, then this number is much smaller, probably closer to 50,000. Consider 70 to 80,000 as a number closer to the upper limit. Now, as I've alluded to, Gondor during King Onderher's reign was nowhere near as strong as Gondor during Hiarmendikil's reign. In the last 600 years or so, Gondor had suffered civil wars, a devastating plague, multiple wars of external foes and had lost much of its outer territory. The Great Plague alone may have wiped out as much as 30 to 40% of Gondor's population, and required Gondor to abandon many of its garrisons. And that was only 300 years before Ondur's reign. Logic dictates that Gondor's army must have been much larger during the reign of Jarmendikill. So how do we get to this number? Well, we kind of have to guess, as there aren't any real hints or guides to go off. If plagues and wars had significantly reduced Gondor's population and territory, then it must have significantly reduced Gondor's army. If Gondor's army was possibly as strong as 80,000 during Ondur's reign, then it would be a fair assumption to say that Gondor's army during Jarmendikill's reign was at least another 50% larger, so around 120,000. And with the amount of territory Gondor was defending, its armies would need to be that large. Of course, this number could be larger, possibly even 150,000 or more. Although I will say that I doubt it would be smaller, unless Ondur's army size is the smaller estimate, and in that case, Gondor's army during Jarmendikill's reign would probably be closer to 100,000. Whether it's the smaller or the larger number, this is an enormous army by Middle-earth standards, but still significantly smaller than the total army of real-world empires such as the Roman Empire. So, as my final answer, I would give the upper estimate of Gondor's army at its height at around 150,000, and the lower estimate at around 100,000. Either way, it just goes to show how far Gondor had fallen by the War of the Ring, and that their strength was only a fraction of what it used to be in the days of old. In saying that, these numbers could all be wrong, as they're only my estimates and definitely aren't canon. To get the actual answer, I'm afraid we'd have to ask Tolkien himself, and unfortunately that isn't possible unless someone here is a necromancer. And even if you are a necromancer, probably don't resurrect Tolkien. It's not a good time to do that. If your next thought is, well, how did Gondor go from as many as 150,000 to barely 20,000, then stay tuned. This will all be covered in depth in War in Middle-earth, as well as other videos I'm planning. I will give a short answer though. Civil wars, external invasions, plagues, the loss of territory, the loss of major cities, constant pressure from invaders, and of course the return of Sauron and the rise of Mordor. All of these things are very bad, and it makes sense why Gondor gradually got weaker and weaker as time went on. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I really enjoyed writing this video. The pure speculation stuff is fun, and it makes me feel like a detective, but instead of solving murders, I'm solving useless stuff. But who said useless things can't be fun? I hope you're doing well wherever you are, and remember, everything used to be bigger and better in the good old days. Okay, that's not actually true, but whatever.